The next speaker is Mr. Edward Kaufman. He is a senior research scholar at the University of Maryland. Mr. Kaufman has worked as a professor at the International School of Haifa University in Israel and served as the executive director of the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem since 1983. Mr. Kaufman was born and raised in Argentina. He has lived and worked in Israel since 1960. I have the pleasure of giving you the floor, Mr. Kaufman. Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm also very happy to be here in this forum. As the professor has said before me, I thank everyone who made this possible. Only two of us came from Israel, 22 hours in airports and planes. For us, it is very important. My colleague actually already spoke yesterday, and it's very important for us to reflect on a great many aspects that this conflict includes and encompasses. I will prefer to address a specific topic that I think is of vital importance to many that are here. That is the role of the diasporas in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict situation. Now more than ever, as we have a last attempt in this decade to bring a negotiation that could perhaps bear fruit, each party must play their role. So the question is, to what degree can the diaspora play a negative role or a positive role, or no role at all? I think that with globalization, this topic becomes more and more timely. I've had the pleasure of having been able to spend half a year researching this. I'm trying to figure out how to begin my PowerPoint presentation. To no avail. Perhaps I could have one of the technicians help me with this.
Yo estaba diciendo de que con la globalización.
I was saying that with globalization, the closeness of the diasporas becomes more important. It is thought that there a phenomenon that is referred to in English, that is, as Benedict Anderson will look at, long-distance nationalism. This means that not the majority of the diaspora, but rather the core, the most involved and committed core of the diaspora, tends to be more extreme than those living the conflict on a day-to-day basis in the conflict area. I'm going to address the issue of Jewish and Arab communities in Latin America. There have been other diasporas as well that have influenced conflicts. Armenia, for example, the Kurds, the Irish Catholics, the Tamil in Sri Lanka. So this is not a phenomenon that is unique to the Jewish and Arab diasporas. Those most involved in the community sometimes, well, now that the Pope is Argentina, and I was born in Argentina, sometimes these groups abroad tend to be more holy than the Pope. And so this is something that, the question is whether this is something that can be avoided, or is this something that... So the PowerPoint is in English. I apologize for that. I'm going to explain it in Spanish, however. And in the Division for Palestinian Rights, there's a broader version of this. For time constraints, I've cut down the presentation a bit, but on the website, if you're interested, it's called Diaspora and Conflict. Because of globalization, also, there's a diaspora studies focus on it, and this is something that increasingly has an impact on conflict. that are not necessarily ideological left or right, but rather they're ethno-political groups that have different religious identities or ethnic identities or linguistic identities. And these are internal conflicts more than others. The last, it was 73 was the last war. It was non-state actors. It was not conventional against the state of Israel or with the state of Israel. So when I speak of populations and not uniform population, I say that the population, of course, is there's a direct link, human contact with the civilian population. The project that we undertake is not a theoretical program, as many of our academic programs are, but rather we learn by doing things. The best way to do this is to look at the way in which in Latin America, people that share a human rights perspective and peace and democracy perspective within the Jewish and Arab communities, specifically the Palestinian community and the Jewish community, to what degree can they, since they have shared values, fight together and support the peace processes in the Holy Land, the process underway between Israelis and Palestinians. The concern, even more so, is that in the Promised Land, if the conflict is not resolved, instead of exporting the coexistence that we have in our countries to the Middle East, what we might see is the reverse. We might see to Latin America an imported phenomenon from the Middle East. In the case of violence in Argentina, we saw that this had been the case. So what we would like to present is not merely a theoretical position, but rather an affirmation on the ground of this. I think it's an extremely good idea to have a youth sector with colleagues that are some Arab, some Jewish. We can call them cousins or family, but the official name would be Argentine Consensus for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. We have this in Uruguay and Chile as well. We have addressed this today and yesterday, and again tomorrow, I think, as well. Tomorrow we'll be looking at a concrete plan of action, and this could be important as well when it comes to following up on this conference. There's a very committed rhetoric here, but we want to see implementation as we move from conference to conference. This hasn't always been the case. Latin America has the luck that the Israeli and Arab communities have come to this content more or less in the same era. So they have a friendly relationship, there's cooperation, there's commerce, and it's worth mentioning this. I say this because the laboratory that we're using in Latin America can be important for Europe, and it can be important for the United States as well. I asked a question of Dr. Sali yesterday. Why are there not consensus groups in Washington, also where I work, between Jews and Palestinians, or Arabs, Palestinians, or Arabs and Israelis, when many of us actually do share an opinion of how to solve the conflict? I would even dare to say that in the United States, part of the Jewish community is part of the conflict more than the solution, more holy than the Pope. We have many examples of this. There are people in the Jewish community that support the most extreme members of the settlement. Netanyahu would have liked to build 2,000 housing units in a certain part of Jerusalem, but these millionaires give money in the United States so that houses be evacuated that had been inhabited by Palestinians either buying the property or illegally seizing the property, expelling the people and the inhabitants from Palestine. This is a real phenomenon. It's national, it's a long-distance nationalism. Thankfully, thank God, it has not been extremely strong phenomenon here in Latin America. So we have a laboratory experience here, and perhaps the Jewish communities we have Jewish communities in Europe, and we've had this forever. The Arab community perhaps a little bit more recent, but in Latin America we have this group here, the seed of an idea that really could multiply. That is to say, these consensus groups. I'm going to jump through the PowerPoint presentation quickly. I don't want to abuse this idea of diagnosis and treatment, but it's a good way to focus. The idea of finding a solution to long-distance nationalism cannot be good unless we have a diagnosis, and unless we know why this happens. So the diagnosis, well, I'll be brief with it. It's very interesting to look at how the Arab and Jewish communities have operated in Latin America. But more than anything, we want to focus on the treatment, not the diagnosis. You'll understand that I will do this briefly. We can't have a diagnosis unless we know what the illness is that makes it so that Jews and Arabs have a same way of thinking about issues such as peace and democracy and human rights, and still they cannot find a way to cooperate for peace in their homelands. So I'm going to ask those here, in what part of Latin America do we have these two streets? And we see it here. This is to add some humor to my presentation. I'm sure someone knows. Buenos Aires. How interesting, no? The crossroads. We have the state of Israel in one direction, and we have Palestine in the other direction. The state of Israel is a broad avenue. Palestine is a small street, but it's there. It's there in Buenos Aires. If I could play with Photoshop, and I don't know how to, what I would do is add the word state above Palestine. State of Palestine. Perhaps for the next meeting I'll learn how to use Photoshop and add the word state. Also, I'd play with the arrows as well. I should say that the Palestine arrow goes up, and the arrow for the State of Israel goes down. I think this is an objective appreciation of what's happening right now with the policies of the two states in Latin America. Some months ago, I had the fortune of being invited to meet Walid Salem, a professor of the University of Quito in Buenos Aires, invited by the Foreign Service School, ISEN, the Superior Institute for National Foreign Service, exactly. And I gave the same PowerPoint presentation, and I said, you're behind with your policy, foreign policy, because we don't have the word state here. It should be there, State of Palestine. We'll have to go back and see if my recommendation is followed up on in Argentina, because this photo was taken a year ago. A lot of things have happened since then. So these are the major research questions. I already explained them. What I want to explain also is why the conflict is so acute and how it's linked to the diaspora. When we use the word diaspora, you'll note that this is just a subcategory of migrants. There are many migrants that have gone from one country to another. And this does not mean that there is long-distance nationalism. Mexicans in the United States, for example, there's no issue, I don't think. I mean, they want to be Americans, perhaps, but they want to be citizens of the United States, but there's no conflict there. So we have this first division under migrants between people that are living in a host country, and the majority of them still have their heads in the homeland. Being there. But those that are more assimilated, we refer to them as being here as opposed to being there. Diaspora doesn't include all migrant groups. It's merely those whose relationship with their homelands has been is strong, a strong relationship with their homelands. If you look at the word diaspora, it's a Greek word. It has a great deal with the Jewish people. Now it's used more generically. That came after the first matter of the first temple, when we began to see a dispersion of Jews throughout the Mediterranean region. The Greeks referred to them as the diaspora, which means dispersion. Some Israelis don't like using the word in Hebrew. They use the word exile, golah, and not the word dispersion. They have different connotations. It's important to understand that distinction. Are they in exile, or are they dispersed throughout areas? And this is even the case in Israel. Then there's another division as well within the diaspora. Is it a violent exodus or a voluntary exodus? The Arab diaspora in Latin America, or the Jewish diaspora in Latin America, many came before or during the Ottoman Empire. They were referred to as Turks, really, when they came from the Ottoman Empire, not as Jews or Arabs, but they're mostly Christians that were being discriminated against by the Ottoman Empire, and there weren't many Jews. There were some. They were a bit protected, but these were the first that came to the Americas, and they came to South America. Jews joined this diaspora. They eventually were escaping European persecution, particularly in some areas. And then for the Arabs, they're refugees that came as refugees after the War of 48, Nakba, the War of Independence of Israel. So our conflict follows the blue arrow. Much of the exodus was violent exodus. And that makes it more difficult to cooperate, no? I'm sorry, let me go backwards. There we go. Finally, and then violent exodus, violence from who? Sometimes there are exiles because they fought against their own government, a dictatorial situation. But it's even more difficult when one feels harmed and expelled by one, but for having been an ethnic group and not an ideological group, a different ethnic group, Palestinians or Arabs or Jews in Europe, if you wish. So the Exodus has to do with an identity group and not an ideology. It's not a left-right issue. It's an ethno-political issue, and that makes cooperation even more difficult because it becomes a people-to-people conflict and not just regime to regime. There are worse regimes. Some are worse than others. There are many that can be named, but sometimes this happens between two different peoples. So, presence in Latin America, Jewish populations. The Jewish population changes over time in Latin America. These numbers are not altogether updated, but I would say that they're close. Some years ago, we said there were 500,000 Jews in Latin America. The people that can't see this, you can turn around perhaps. I certainly want you to be able to see this slide. You can see it on my computer screen, okay, but perhaps my colleagues will want to turn around to be able to see it on the screen. There have been changes, a reduction of the Jewish population in Latin America at some 30%. A little bit more than half immigrated back to Israel. Around 100,000 Latin Americans are now living in Israel. The other half, or some of them went to Europe, Spain, Mexico, leaving South America, some to the United States as well for economic reasons as well. It's very important also to know the history and relations between the Jewish population in Latin America and Israel. For reasons of time, I'm going to move forward, but I'll sum this up. There is a lot of confusion in Latin America between Israeli and Israelites, not just with the common folk. Sometimes people even here speaking make a linguistic mistake and they confuse Israelite with Israeli. It's an interesting story because in Latin America we refer to the Jews as Israelites, Israelitas. In the organized Jewish organizations, they're referred to as Israelites and not Jews. perhaps we can address that later if you want to. But the relations between Israelites and Israelis the concepts are close, but sometimes people in the Jewish community, they say, why don't you ask your ambassador when we're discussing things? Your ambassador, meaning the ambassador of Israel. And there's a very strong perception of closeness there, and there is closeness. And one can realize that there is a big difference between why there's so much closeness in some areas, whereas it is difficult for the Arab communities, even though there are a great many. There are 300,000 some Jews in Brazil, perhaps 10 million Arabs. Why such a big difference? So the Israeli ambassador has a community role as well. He goes to the synagogue, he participates in these events. He also has a political role. He's very much involved in the Jewish communities. While some are more nationalist than some of the Israeli ambassadors that are in their countries. But when there's more moderate governments, such as during the times of Rabin, one can see a difference. Some community leaders have a more extreme position than the representatives of the Israeli government. So there are many factors here that we could analyze and look into. There are a great many less Jews than Arabs, but there's a stronger commitment to Israel as a country by these Jews. So what does Israel have? So is it a link to the government of Israel or the country? There's an extraordinary speaker yesterday who said very important things and said it's worth looking at. Instead of criticizing everything Israel does, how about criticize what the government does? As Ambassador Ibrahim said, it is a pluralist society, and we need to recognize this. There are sectors that are pro-peace, both in the diaspora and in Israel. So I'm going to move to the Arab portion of this. The numbers are very difficult to establish because there is no census. There's no updated census, and it's not, or a rigid census. So if we were to look at sometimes we have to look at the footnotes to look at these numbers. I had a research assistant from Palestine that also looked at the Arab sources. It's very difficult to get exact figures. There are very variants. For example, in Brazil, how many Arabs are there in Brazil? They speak of 12 million of Arab descent. Arab descent, even the word descent, implies a long-distance relationship than Israeli or Israelite. And that's a problem for those who want to fight for peace. How do we mobilize both communities in a parallel manner? The group that's here, the consensus groups, have said very clearly that we have to mobilize both groups at the same time. My colleague Omar will look at this in Argentina. We talk about working with two legs, not just with one. So we do have numbers here. But we're not sure how to break down these numbers. It's Palestinians, Arabs, there's the Arab Peace Initiative. They should all be supporting that if they're Arabs, but that's just not the case. Or Muslims. How do we categorize these individuals? There are 2% in Gaza that's Christian, and 98%. I have 20 minutes left. Is that what you're telling me? No. I've been speaking for 20 minutes. Compared to the United States as well, we see here that the numbers in Latin America of Muslims is not small. Many are converts. Some actually come from India as well, and they're Hindus or Pakistanis. Indians are Pakistanis. In Brazil, we might have some 20 million Arabs, and Palestinians, 600,000. That would seem to be the double of the Jewish population in Latin America. The large Palestinian population is focused particularly in Chile, where we have the largest exile or diaspora for Palestinian people, more than in Lebanon, the descendants of them. But I do think that they do identify themselves as Palestinians, or Chilean Palestinians, or Palestinian Chileans. And then El Salvador as well, and then Honduras as well. That makes up 3/4 of the numbers. So if you're looking for cousins, sometimes there are a lot of Jews and not very many Palestinians. Sometimes there are not so many Jews, but a lot of Palestinians. In El Salvador, for example, we have tried to bring together these groups of cousins. There are 300 Jews and thousands of Palestinians. So if this group of Jews includes kids and adults, sometimes we just find 3 or 4 that want to participate, but the Palestinian group is very much in favor of the initiative. I don't have time, but I would direct you to the website. There is a problem of identity, which is similar to what we see with the Israelis or Israelites. There are 5 identities. There's a religious identity, an ethnic identity, a national identity. The Palestinian people define themselves as such as of around 1920. Prior to that, they felt they're part of the greater Syria. And then, since they were very much divided on the level of national identities. Those who came as Turks did not define themselves as Palestinians at the end of the 20th century. They came to define themselves as Arab Turks or Syrian Turks or Syrians, and it was only as of 48 that we began to see a very strong Palestinian identity that came because with their violent expulsion from their lands. I'm going to see if I can conclude now. You have to also look at the prognosis. You have to think about the future. If the Jews and the Arabs don't work together, if there is no peace in Israel and Palestine, what is going to be the situation of the Jewish and Arab or Palestinian communities in Latin America? There are 3 scenarios. They're on the screen. Hoping that we don't focus on the worst possible one, but there are 3 and they're on the website. What's most important is to look at how to bridge the 2 diasporas, how to bring them together. Here, there are lots of lessons that we've learned based on our failures. There have been attempts in the past in some countries such as Argentina and Brazil to have Arabs and Jews working together for peace, but many have failed. When there's a war over there in the homeland, that's when it fails. When things get violent over there, this possibility of cooperation here sometimes fails. We are looking for resilience. How do we say this in Spanish? Resilience. Fortaleza. Resilience among these cousins that are working together. And trust, mutual trust, working together. The idea being to avoid the errors of the past, so that when we need this cooperation, it's there. There are a lot of ideas under the new heading of New Approach. Many times we see the left, I'm part of the left, divide and subdivide like an amoeba. And this sometimes happens elsewhere. Sometimes we fight over a statement. We see Gaza. Who began it? Who started it? I'm not going to look into who fired the first shot. There are different interpretations of it. But really, it's relevant because in the end, we see statements made that have no effect over there. So what these groups are doing now is supporting peace initiatives with a significant amount of Jews and Palestinians here. We need to create documents that support what's going on over there. We see this with the Geneva document. We do see obstacles, many potential obstacles, but I think that what we're looking for is what new things under the sun can we do so that here in Latin America, on the governmental level and on the level of people, because it's a people-to-people situation, to what degree can we help? There are many diplomats in Latin America that, in their own countries, sometimes there's a handful of Jews and there are some Arabs and Palestinians. Sometimes they try to help them to make sure that they work together here in Latin America. And they try to get them to support the countries with a policy of peace and self-determination for both peoples. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to distinguished Mr. Kaufman for that detailed presentation on the reality of the communities of the diaspora and the promotion of peace. You would need much more time, of course, for a presentation such as that. I'm not sure if we have access to the documents that Mr. Kaufman has. I think we should, because it's excellent background information for any analysis that we might undertake diplomatically or academically. So I very much thank him, and I'm sorry to have to cut you off. It's the odious task of the moderator that I must uphold so that the other colleagues can also speak.